This is partly a lament to the ever-changing Cotwold country pub and its lack of constancy and priority within the march of single concept, clear marketing of consumerism within the capitalist model, and a how-to video on the nutritional and health-giving properties of real cask ales, not your mass-produced chemical lagers, your blonde. There are still so many of them to discover, and I really should do a how-to on how to discover them. There's so many little lanes, so many little villages, single-track roads, riverside secrets, there to be discovered. How should you do this? Well, I'd recommend at least a day van. A camper would be ideal, where you don't need to have someone share the driving. If you think about it, you can do a pub crawl in a day van. You can start 11:30, traditionally pubs used to open. So, have a pint in one. You can drive a very zigzagging, meandering route because you're discovering the lanes, not because you've had a pint. Find another pub and have another pint. Choose a different ale. Try and choose the pubs from camera, real ale, cask ale guide. By this time, you could still drive on to another place, perhaps to eat. The beers, but craft artisanal ales. Government taxation of public houses serving beer and wine is far from looking out for our health. It's a tax on people meeting and exchanging ideas freely. The legislation that condemned rave culture of the 90s made it essentially illegal for 6 or more people to meet. Those 6 or more people could be meeting in a public house and regularly exchanging revolutionary ideas, starting movements and societies in a environment that's safe, neutral territory, where everyone's free to share. Why a how-to video? Gruit is the centre of this. Groot or Grut is essentially a bouquet garni type idea that you might add to food. A herb mixture might be used for bittering or just flavouring any type of beer, really. In with the mash, in with the wort. These are a part of your artisanal craft beers, but for decades now have been missing from the international dross that we get pumped through our televisions for us to buy. I recognise that different latitudes need different things. Your cool, crisp, blonde lager does cut through the heat of the Mediterranean, I confess. When it comes to the Caribbean and Creole areas, it's adding ginger and citrus that first gave us the shandy. Now, what is a shandy? I can hear Americans drawl calling Britain and Europe and Australia, and we know what shandy is. It's rather nice in the summer. It's a bit like small beer. What is small beer? I'll have to get to that as well, won't I? But this video has partly been inspired by news that over the last couple of years, Americans are slowly starting to discover the shandy. Now, there is Bertram shandy, but that isn't really it. It's got a certain reputation as being a slightly effeminate drink to order. Lemonade that dilutes any beer or ale to the point that it's low enough alcohol content that it's legal to serve to children. Perhaps half beer, half lemonade, or perhaps just a lager top. Just the last inch of the pint. 2 or 3 inches of the pint topped up with lemonade. How can Americans, especially not from the deep south, too busy with their bourbons or something, how can they not know this? But small beer, its fermentation is a preserving process. You're familiar with kimchi, perhaps? Another fermentation preserving process. Way back when, every village would have a family that kept the closely guarded secret of how to brew. Beer was in no way expensive, it was a daily thing for everyone. There was the time when any town of any size, the water sources would have been polluted with sewage. People did throw sewage out onto the street. They did have to go a long way for their water sometimes. The communal fountain would have horses drinking from it, and who knows what went down the well. Small beer was a way of killing off germs. It was the bottled water of its day. It was just another little income stream. Some were obviously more popular and saleable than others, but if that proved the case, someone from the clan going on international publishing site and giving away the clan's secrets, you don't educate people for free. Knowledge is passed on from trusted generation to trusted generation after a period of apprenticeship and learning that you've paid for with your offspring, basically, becoming indentured. A cottage industry, though, predominantly female members of the family were the brewers. Perhaps the greatest peril would have been collecting your bouquet garni or groot for the beer, leaving you open to accusations of witchcraft. There were, of course, monk brewers in monasteries that grew. Well, they did grow hemp and include hemp in the mix of the beer, but they cultivated very strong beers and kept very keenly very strong yeast for beers and ales. Yes, monks got drunk and stoned, or at least some orders did for some periods. Well, there were those nights and the crusades that needed supplying. But until the Second World War and after, the milk that was produced in an area pretty much stayed in an area and was transformed into different things, but transporting milk tended to lead to TB, tuberculosis epidemics. Not so much from the milk, but the lack of hygiene of the containers for the milk. Kefir, fizzy yoghurt milk drink never really came back from the Crusades and took off. But another preserving method. Now in Britain we like our ales warm. Not warm as in heated up, room temperature. Sweet, full-bodied and fruity, without hops. With malted grains, but without hops. Malted barley rich beers and, of course, ales are predominantly a carbohydrate. Any self-respecting farmhouse of yesteryear would have had the brew at three different stages, and a potage on the stove. This potage was a very, very thick soup of constantly changing vegetables. It was constantly replenished with every day's fresh produce that was available from the market or the garden. The same core soup would be there slowly on the stove for a week or longer. Just how your spaghetti bolognese gets better the next day, so too the potage soup. If you're lucky, there might be some meat in the soup. But you need to have your gallon of beer every day. In almshouses and provision for the poor, a gallon of beer a day was what was needed for hydration, and given the same as millennials carry around with them with their little sippy cup water bottle things. And then there was your daily bread, the 3 ingredients of your diet, the gallon of beer, the potage soup, and the loaf of bread. Thin, tinned soup that we are so familiar with. Do you drink or eat soup? Well, that's a debate for another time, isn't it? Depends if you use a spoon or not, I think. But just the same as you can't consider that consommé as anything close to potage and really call them both soup. Beer with good gruet becomes so much more nutritional than just carbohydrate. The malted barley rich beers are rich in silicon. I've piqued your interest now, which is good for bones and maintaining the health of bones. It's got a lot of ortholocylic acid, a mineral that helps the body metabolise things. There's a lot of magnesium, antioxidants, and, well, there's several minerals and vitamins. If you had to grow it, you're choosing what vitamins and minerals to add to those that are already there. Lagers, a bit of a waste of time in that respect. They're the most consommé soup of the lot. A stout, porter, like Guinness, It is almost a meal, isn't it? Anywho, there's B vitamins in beer by the truckload. And it fills you up. Beer only ever used to be taxed when it got to a certain strength. Juniper berries and twigs, mosses and lichens were added in Scandinavian countries. With so many vegetables having an aniseed taint to them, it's easy to see how licorice could be a good palate pairing. Who now isn't tempted to add a gruit bouquet garni to their mash? Bouquet garni to their mash of sage or rosemary or bog myrtle or an antiseptic. Adding seasonal ingredients would change. You've got summer, spring, winter brews. Spruce tree tips. Are you familiar with the scent of fresh pine sap? There's a reason why so much gorse hedges grow. A popular ingredient, common heather, ground ivy, horehound, mugwort, sweet gale, yarrow. A huge variety, I'm sure I'm getting this across. Ginger, caraway seeds, aniseed, nutmeg, cinnamon, mint, and just your garden vegetables. Or perhaps rather salads and herbs. The seeds of rocket are powerful things. In France, for the first time, in the home of wine, we tend to think, for centuries, beer is now more popular than wine. This is causing problems for the wine industry, but the number of beer producers is expanding and improving. It's not just all Soissons Quatre. All beer isn't Belgian. Sweet gale gets added to the mash. Wild bergamot, Sitka spruce tips, spices as well as herbs, verbena, chamomile, coriander, orange peel, the flowers of almost anything remotely fragrant, woodworm, mugwort, turmeric, lemongrass, elderberries, Earl Grey tea, a Grenache grape. Did I say lavender, chamomile, elderberry? I'm tempted to explore what grains of paradise are that the brewer puts in by hand. Hyssop, peppercorns, dandelion, thyme, mugwort, oak bark. There are no end of healthy herb books out there now, are there? If you're doing the do and putting on a brew, throw it in. Experiment, go wild, travel back in time through your taste buds. 1 gallon mash at a time. Go for it, wart and all. Wart and all. Warts and all was how I used to like a Cotwold country pub. Go for it, wart and all. Wart and all. Warts and all was how I used to like a Cotswold country pub, especially in the autumn. The proprietors would just start to put on the log fires that crackled in the hearth. lit up the room with a non-uniform, non-conformist flicker. There was a buzz and a glow of warmth from people's cheeks as much as anything. The small, dark casks of oak behind the bar, stacked high and wide, of several different types from a couple of different seasons, each with their own tap. There was always a few shiny brass phalluses on the bar that could provide the more well-travelled stock further afield from the cellars through the pipework. There was always food available of some time till a certain time, but very much secondary. The lounge and the bar given over to different things, not a male preserve and a female preserve, but the ingrained patina, the dirt of the flagstone floors of ages, has given way these days. It's been cleaned up, sanitised, the walls no longer the colour taken on through the smoke of the years of logs. Yes, the log fires are often still there, but just the same as the townscapes have had their buildings cleared of all the history of coal-fired homes that made many of our cities look like black-faced buildings rather than the honey-coloured stone so famous in northern Cotswolds and the paler beiges of the southern Cotswold country areas. Not so stained externally, because there hasn't been that particular pollution. Yes, our cities look a lot more cheerful, I suppose, brighter, but we have falsified how we depended on the pits until Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came along. So this autumn, the logs are crackling in the grates between the fire dogs, the ironwork of ages, but the whole pub environment has been given over to food. And I would like to say, and the worship of the celebrity chef in residence, but in so many cases, it's the profit margin that's being worshipped. It's the same food that's delivered on the same trucks, already pre-prepared by the supplier, often far from local, that can enable the tightest of margins for the publican. We all lead quite sedentary lifestyles. When you go out for your Sunday lunch, you want a traditional roast meal. Yes, you get a cartoon of a Yorkshire pudding. But to order a beer, an ale, well, you have to have it before the meal, like a starter. Your beer has to be the hors d'oeuvre, or you just can't manage the beer and the hefty meal. There's the Christmas trade and the summer tourist, but in the autumn you do have the crackling fire, but the customers hardly pay for the log. Where once there were several village pubs, these have slowly dwindled and diminished in number, many of them given over to housing. Quite good quality conversions, a lot of them. Few maintaining the bar. Surely making a wonderful kitchen, an authentic feature. Some public houses were just one-room affairs, like they're going into someone's living room and your behaviour changes accordingly. You're not a lager lout. Micro-breweries are only possible when it's a free house, not owned by a major brewing concession, which in the interests of profits for their own brews would limit the artisanal craft ales. Casks behind the bar would just be considered a liability in terms of health and safety. A stainless steel or plastic barrel, not quite the same atmosphere, but product, yes, okay. Along with the fireside and the camaraderie, when you're amenable, the added value, the plus ingredient, is a folk band with traditional instruments. If a group of artists from the locality want to practice without the earache from the family and the neighbours, they can get together for a jam session, form an ever-changing series of band members in the very loosest possible sense, and this is how it's always been. Prestbury, Bishop's Cleeve area, north of Cheltenham, When you went to the Cheltenham races, you may well have sought out not necessarily the famous racing pubs like the Hollow Bottom. Yes, you heard me right on the name. There's a lot of amusing pub names, of course. But the Hollow Bottom is my favourite. But it doesn't tend to have that musical ingredient. In the centre of Cheltenham, there's what used to be the Crown and Cushion for generations, hundreds of years. It's just had its doors reinstated that were closed because, I don't know how they've managed this, it was closed because the road became such a busy A40 and drunk people would stumble out and potentially get run over. I think it might have alleviated because people just can't afford to get drunk in the pub anymore. Must have been written into the risk assessment. But the Crown and Cushion, if it doesn't, really should have a blue plaque on the wall saying this is where Brian Jones, local artist that formed and cultivated the early sound of the Rolling Stones, learnt his craft as a musician in numerous ever-revolving series of musician band ensembles until he became the driving force behind the Rolling Stones with their Canties boys that then kicked him out of the band when they needed that commercial acclaim and success and sold their souls to the devil and left the folk sound, the roots sound behind. In Painswick, little more than a single soul, often multi-talented musician, doing little more than busking inside in the warm, is the only pale imitation that the modern commercial environment can afford. And it's difficult to see that, say, a Heston Blumenthal celebrity chef, ex-pub environment I'll call it, would really be able to accommodate a British ad hoc folk band and singer scene. While this is a lament for the Cotwold country pub, there are still so many of them to discover, and I really should do a how-to on how to discover them. There's so many little lanes, so many little villages, single-track roads, riverside secrets, there to be discovered. How should you do this? Well, I'd recommend at least a day van. A camper would be ideal, where you don't need to have someone share the driving. If you think about it, you can do a pub crawl in a day van. You can start 11:30, traditionally pubs used to open. So, have a pint in one. You can drive. You can drive a very zigzagging, meandering route because you're discovering the lanes, not because you've had a pint. Find another pub and have another pint. Choose a different ale. Try and choose the pubs from a camera, real ale, cask ale guide. By this time, you could still drive on to another place, perhaps to eat. Perhaps you want that celebrity chef experience. Why not? It's a beautiful pub in a beautiful environment. You could have another beer, but then you need to sleep it off. Sleep it off for a couple of hours. perhaps 3 hours, you've had 3 beers. If you leave it another hour after that, you'll be pretty much completely sober. 2 or 3 hours sleep, you're able to drive to another pub, have another pint, have another snooze. It might take you half an hour or an hour to get to your destinations. It may take you longer. Stop, take in the scenery, go on a country walk, and get back to the pub. Take a selfie with your local equestrian celebrity. Jaunty, get a picture with Jaunty. If David Parker's in his stately home, have a chat with one of the jockeys. There's always jockeys in the Hollow Bottom. Time it for autumn, wrap up warm, take in the colour. Western Burt Arboretum, it's all around you. You don't need to pay the entrance fee of $1.50 just to see them. Autumnal, fall, colour, the leaves fall, so let's call the season fall. It's all around you, like Cotwold love. Take cider with Rosie with you. Perhaps come back in summer for the cider. The scrumpy. Camp overnight in the pub car park and start your pub crawl again in the morning. You can spend a week or 2 doing this and you're going to love every minute of it. It's not difficult to find a campsite in the Cotswolds. It's not difficult to find somewhere to do a stand-up wash. The country streams are bearable. Do you see what I did there? And temperature-wise, but don't go in the Severn. It's strong tides. You get washed away. Strong swimmers only. And there's not really much in the way of beach possibility. It goes deep quite quick. The Red Lion at Wayloads, it's got a campsite attached. There's others. Take a camper pub crawl round Cotswold country pubs. Autumn, spring. Winter would be harder. Summer, too populated. Autumn is perfect. This is partly a lament to the ever-changing Cotswold country pub and its lack of constancy and priority within the march of single concept, clear marketing of consumerism within the capitalist model, and a how-to video on the nutritional and health-giving properties of real cask ales, not your mass-produced chemical lagers, your blonde beers, but craft artisanal ales. Government taxation of public houses serving beer and wine is far from looking out for our health. It's a tax on people meeting and exchanging ideas freely. The legislation that condemned rave culture of the 90s made it essentially illegal for 6 or more people to meet. Those 6 or more people could be meeting in a public house and regularly exchanging revolutionary ideas, starting movements and societies in a environment that's safe, neutral territory, where everyone's free to share. Why a how-to video? Gruit is the centre of this. Groot or Grut is essentially a bouquet garni type idea that you might add to food. A herb mixture that might be used for bittering or just flavouring any type of beer, really. In with the mash, in with the wort. What did your daughter do at school today? What did your daughter do at school today? She may have had her turn to read to class. Disrupted by more challenging students, intimidated, and doesn't want to read to class anymore, despite teachers' efforts. Meticulous and extensive strategies. She might have had her learning disrupted by one or more or several children in the classroom with baby bladder, that their parents insist that there's no need for them to try and use the muscles to hold and not need to go to the toilet every time the teacher needs to explain the learning to the whole class or take the register, perhaps. Your daughter may have used her pester power that you'll be more than familiar with at home. Can you resist the nagging? The mithering, it tends to be called in Northern England. Nagging, it tends to have some negative connotations for women of yesteryear for some reason, in my mind. She may have had her learning disrupted by one or a number of people in the class wanting to argue any subject at all or no subject at all with the teacher as they try and do the register and as they try and present what work needs doing at the start of the lesson to the whole class. She may be the persistent arguer. Do you insist that school mollycoddles your child? You may be insisting that your child and their immediate needs, however inspired they are, come first before another 20 or 30 other children all at once. We'll come back to this, of course. As always, the images here tell one story, and the dialogue are connected, but another story. A town that gets described as described as the centre of the Cotswolds. Swing when you're winning, other and opposite when you're not. Brexit has brought about a real decline and vacation of real prestige properties that would never usually come about. Well, throughout the Cotswolds, really. Not to overstate it, but there's some picture postcard, world-famous Cotswold towns and villages that have got portfolios of properties in the same town up for sale. These are properties that would usually never come up, would be kept in the family because they're just so hard to come by and have an innate value. Often in more boom times, they'd be popular with the design workshops or the footballers' wives' hobby shop, not necessarily footballers' wives, but a rich, idle wife that wants a hobby that perhaps costs more than it brings in. And they want a beautiful location where they can attract in even richer, possibly more idle people than themselves, and have a lovely time. Lifestyle choice properties, individually and as a whole, are often going to be foreign owners, and they're just leaving Britain, leaving the countryside in droves and the country, and no one's noticing. A lot of signboards going up in town, a lot of charity shops in the high street. Accessibility to these properties are why people manufacture a slump. A slump isn't teleological from God. People gain from other people's misery and induce it. We can question First Testament economics, Zionists that are themselves anti-Semitic. We can try and blame Cambridge Analytica, but really, it's everyone that voted Brexit, and they didn't have the sense to see that they were being used. It's a race to the bottom, I tell you. mollycoddling into the gutter, and that brings Brexit. What did your daughter do at school today? What did your daughter do at school today? She may have had her turn. This is since the introduction of timetable efficiencies, I think. It's slightly, since teachers have become more and more qualified, they've become more and more expensive. Certainly in boom times, people could just walk into better paid jobs in private industry. But now, private industry people are scrabbling desperately to get some reliable, dependable income like teaching. Timetable efficiency has meant that, before mobile phones and instant access internet, schools had to give less lessons to individual teachers. It gave them more headspace, but it also made them available for when other teachers were ill or something, couldn't make it into school. Whether it was their usual subject or not, all the children knew exactly where they stood with all the teachers. It didn't get as bad as primary, one teacher, one form group. But now with mobile phones and internet, supply teachers, cover teachers, they're instantly available. Call them and they'll be there half an hour later. You can shove them into a classroom with no cover work for them to present to the children and expect them to work miracles. Some of them can. And schools just will not support the supply teacher, the same as they do the regular teacher, even though close. The children, they've never met this person before. They're supposed to do what they're told. Now, it is really the most natural thing in the world not to do what a stranger tells you just because you're in a different environment where the school tells you you must. But at the same time, a highly investigated and qualified supply teacher isn't there to hurt your child. Your child is there to hurt them. One child that needs to be listened to in one class is abusing, basically, the human rights of 20 or 30 others. So often meeting that child, it's like, just know what parents can do. Often they work at school. One department may be 2 staff down, but to ask for the cover work for the children, you're belittling the teacher. I know, can't get my head around that either. But you work through an agency as a supply or a cover teacher, and that agency gets feedback from schools. Any student can create any situation, and it can get reported back to the agency that the teacher has been made to feel that way, not the student. But your daughter wants to do her own investigations of what the supply cover teacher is like. They don't want to depend on what the school and what the assessment organisations have to say. 14 can be a difficult age, especially for a girl. What's that, about year 9 usually in the UK? This new person in their life might become as important to them as some of their other teachers. They need to experiment and see what they're like. They need to test them, and that comes in many different forms. Many of them constitute the child assaulting the teacher. Not all. Some 14-year-old girls are very developed. They feel the need to squeeze past the teacher unnecessarily. They're experimenting on them. Some run round and round the class, like chasing, and they're sort of wanting you to block their way ever so slightly so that they can't cause such disruption and build up to such a crescendo. They have no obligation to stop. You might think, well, if the teacher can't do it to them, they can't do it to the teacher. I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. It's nonsense. Makes a useful adage, but nonsense. Judges, like judges in courts, go through a process, essentially a victim-blaming process, according to what complicity there was. Sadly, in America still, there's some Republican judges that ascribe she was begging for it mentality to some of their judgments. Your daughter and her friends may well have ganged up on the supply teacher and behaved like a pack of dogs, really, throughout the lesson, loosely calling it here a lesson. A class full of children can really act together like a pack. It's quite an amazing thing to see sometimes. Existentially, it can create almost an out-of-body experience. When you've got, more usually half a dozen, it takes that many to form the pack, you see. But sometimes up to 20, it's often girls. The 10 to 20 girls, including your daughter possibly, if it's the ringleader, have been shouting and barking their need, their instructions over the instructions that the supply teacher is trying to read from their regular teacher. They're not wanting to work, they're wanting to descend on the supply teacher as a pack for the whole of the hour. This can be physical crowding, it can be just shouting out one after the other all at the time, getting louder and louder. I don't want to use the word frenzy really, but on rare occasions your daughter can work her way into a frenzy of this pack activity, much the same as a football crowd can act like animals. Now, you can't describe your daughters as a pack of dogs, but wolves might be more acceptable to the senior leadership team that you're trying to describe the problem to. While wolves does tend to describe ripping and tearing, and it's not really, it's more when the wolves crowd round, like in The Revenant, I think it is. No, there's a couple of films with it. The wolves crowd round and they're growling. They're stronger as a pack than the human. It's only a matter of time until he is their prey. Or she, there's a he in the film, you see. That's just one lesson, but of course if it's happened in one lesson, it gets spread as, great laugh, we were doing this. And it can be 3 lessons in a day that you account, and there's another 2 that might be almost as bad. There are, of course, some of the pack, and it's not always an exclusively female pack, don't get me wrong, that start to pity the prey a little bit, and they do recognise what's happening and their part in what's happening. And the group does get a little bit smaller over days and weeks. Now, the she-wolf of the female dog pack, obviously isn't always, but maybe part of the senior leadership's team family. There may be a husband and a wife at the school. And that doesn't mean that the children are automatically going to be horrendous. Far from it. But they're likely to have a distinctive, very passive-aggressive, strong whip snap to their tail, even if they're model pupils. Now, you think this pack of dogs is a metaphor, perhaps an analogy, a simile. It's far from an isolated incident when it's not. Completely out of the blue, you will get a girl, when the teacher walks up to them, asking them to be on task. They don't want to. stop doing some taking selfies of themselves and their friends. She doesn't want to be asked again to try and get on task, please. This is the girl barking at the teacher. Now, once one starts, the crazy behaviour starts to become the norm. And so, while it can be an isolated incident, there's certainly instances of more than one, more than three 14-year-old girls barking at one teacher, asking students to be on task and do the work that the school and their regular teacher has said, can result in the student perhaps thinking that, I don't know what they're thinking quite honestly, thinking that the teacher is expecting them to perform like seals, I don't know, expecting them to jump to it after being asked half a dozen or a dozen times, create some instant history of having gone through getting to know the person, and they're not just a stranger in front of you barking orders to get on task, even closer to whimpering pleases to get on task. Your daughter today was on her knees on the classroom, walking around on all fours, barking, and the teacher's stepping away from the crazy behaviour, obviously. She's barking at another student that's supposed to be outside, but they're doing a circuit, and in, do a circuit, out again. She's trying to bark at the service of the teacher, I think, trying to get the student to be outside where they've been put outside to wait for the senior leadership team to come and collect them. Member, not team. Only takes one. Because the senior leadership have a threat. They threaten. They have a useful mechanism that they can employ without questioning. Now, you might think that your daughter is a little bit embarrassed about this behaviour, but it marks her out. When the senior leadership arrive for the other child that's waiting for them, that it's taken 10 minutes to get on an email and have them called, when the senior leadership person arrives, the supply teacher says, you have to explain why you think certain students should be removed. Do you remember what were you doing? Running round and round. How many times did you? About 3. I felt uncomfortable about it, but I did put my arm out or try and cover the gangway so you would slow down. You made the right choice and stopped, but then you changed your mind and pushed on through the teacher. I mean, I wasn't offering any resistance, so I didn't get pushed over. And how many times did you run around the class? About half a dozen. I think that's probably more like it. And are you feeling okay about, you could perhaps share with the SLT call out, what was our interaction like earlier in the lesson towards the start? The student has no shame at all in recreating the barking. This is your daughter. Can you believe it's your daughter? It is your daughter. This is what your daughter is like. The classroom, it's a safe environment. Apart from those, the parents aren't going to complain. The senior leadership's husband and wife's problem child, shall we call them, is intimidating and bullying and restricting the learning of the most needy in the classroom, whose parents aren't going to complain. This isn't a metropolitan place by any stretch of the imagination. It's a countryside area, and everyone knows everyone, and they know their social status. To senior leadership in a family money house, they've got money. This is interesting to some of the girls that don't come from money. They can befriend someone, they can identify someone, they might have the same unusual coloured hair, or spend a lot of time in the reflection room. Have a shared sense of play. Now, you would think that this same unusual coloured hair boy and girl seem inseparable in their sense of play. It can be necessary. There isn't always two doors to put them outside. You can put them either side of the door. Some schools you can't even put them outside. You want to be moving them around the room. You don't know who they do. You have some sense, but it is really only a sense who they get on with, who they don't get on with, who you can put them next to, who it really is a mistake. You have a seating plan. It's obviously printed out, so there's no chance of reading it or recognising the photos, because then the department would have to hold the detentions. But for the girl to have access, potentially in the future, to something more than friendship and access to the family money, or just be invited along to nicer occasions, she's going to show off to this same unusual coloured hair child. But most of all, she wants to experiment on the teacher, the adult in the classroom. See what she does and how they react or don't react at, or it's boring teaching. Your daughter today, on the power pole that goes from floor to ceiling, that carries the electricity for the sockets, pole dancing for quite an extended period in the middle of the lesson. I think it was geography. Was it geography? Did look a little bit like a science lesson. But for 5 minutes and intermittently for 30 seconds at a time, teacher trying best to just pretend they haven't noticed. Pole dancing. It's one girl's pole dancing lessons to the others. I mean, I dread to think what sort of eyeful the kicking the leg up in the wisp of a skirt was given to the poor people that were giving her any attention. Sometimes it's just best to give people no attention. Now, on some other ruse, she gets put out the door. I know, it sounds like putting your dog out for a wee, doesn't it, at night? Where in the corridor, she's bending over and then turning around flat of her back against the wall, and rhythmic movements of her arms above her head and her legs out and wide, caressing the back wall. Just stay there and calm down for a bit and get bored, and I'll come and speak to you in a minute. Your nice, privileged, small town school, your daughter is either barking like a dog or pole dancing to impress the new fresh meat in school. Who would be impressed with such amateur dramatics? That goes from floor to ceiling, that carries the electricity for the sockets. Pole dancing for quite an extended period in the middle of the lesson. I think it was geography. Was it geography? Did look a little bit like a science lesson. But for 5 minutes and intermittently for 30 seconds at a time, teacher trying best to just pretend they haven't noticed. Pole dancing. It's one girl's pole dancing lessons to the others. I mean, I dread to think what sort of eyeful the kicking the leg up in the wisp of a skirt was given to the poor people that were giving her any attention. Sometimes it's just best to give people no attention. Now, on some other ruse, she gets put out the door. I know, it sounds like putting your dog out for a weed, doesn't it, at night? We're in the corridor. She's bending over and then turning around, flat of her back against the wall, and rhythmic movements of her arms above her head and her legs out and wide, caressing the back wall. Just stay there and calm down for a bit and get bored, and I'll come and speak to you in a minute. Your nice, privileged, small town school, your daughter is either barking like a dog or pulling dogs to impress the new fresh meat in the school. Who would be impressed with such amateur dramatics? Britain, global warming every year, year on year, the first harvest is getting earlier. End of May, the first harvest. In France, earlier still, second harvest of certain crops can be seen. And the last harvest of St. Michaelmas getting later. St. Michaelmas, the date when the devil fell from heaven and fell into a blackberry bush and spat on it or urinated on it, depending on where in Britain you come from. So you shouldn't eat or pick blackberries in Britain after the first week in October, because they've been cursed. Also the patron saint's day of the police, and the Lord Mayor of London is elected on this day. Wild coincidence.